Well, I want to welcome all of you. I want to welcome all of you and invite all of you to shut up. I'd like to get started. We have a lot to talk about today. We're going to be discussing the book of Joshua. Any book that carries that name is worth discussing. Every time I read it or think about it, I'm reminded of a song that I used to sing a few years ago when I was 12 years old. And I want to invite you to join me as an introduction to today's session on Joshua. I'm sure you all know the refrain. But I just want to caution you, do not sing it loud. It's dangerous. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. You can talk about your man of element, talk about your man of Saul, but give me good old Joshua at the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. The walls came tumbling down. The story of Joshua and Jericho is one of the most famous Baba Mises in the entire Bible. When we left off our discussions on the Bible last time, Moses had led the children of Israel to the promised land on the eastern side of Jericho, at the southern tip of Palestine. Then he did a very wise and thoughtful thing. He appointed the best person that he knew to be his successor. Joshua had served Moses from the very beginning of the Exodus from Egypt. When the children of Israel first entered Sinai, they were attacked by the Amalekites. They were a tribe native to the Sinai. And the story is told in the Bible that Moses had to raise his arms, and as long as his arms were raised, the Israelites were winning the battle against the Amalekites. How long can you raise your arms? Even Moses couldn't hold his arms up endlessly. So what did they do? They put some stones by his chair, and he rested his elbows on the stones and held up his arms. Well, Anybody can do that. But Joshua led the fight against the Amalekites successfully. Later on, when they got close to the land of Israel, Moses appointed 12 scouts to scout out the land and to bring back a report. One of those 12 scouts was Joshua. Joshua and Caleb were the only two of those 12 who brought back a positive report. What does it mean, a positive report? All of the 12 agreed that it's a land of milk and honey. It's beautiful. They even brought back a load of fruit, famous symbol of Israel's Ministry of Tourism, are the two of the scouts carrying between them an enormous bunch of grapes. Sure, it's beautiful, but impossible, mission impossible. It's so well guarded and protected by fortresses and soldiers. It would be suicide to even try to take over the land of Israel. Only Joshua and Caleb came back with that same report, but said it's worth a try. What have we got to lose? Stay in the desert forever? God will help us. Go for it. And the people followed the majority and decided not to go for it. So Joshua had been at Moses' side from day one. And when Moses served 40 years, he did exactly what I did. Or I did exactly what he did. I retired. And he retired after 40 years of leading his people. But at the retirement, he appointed Joshua to take his place. And the Bible then goes on to say that Joshua became like Moses, did things that Moses did. Not on quite a large scale, but still pretty good. Moses led the children of Israel across the Red Sea on dry land. Joshua led the children of Israel across the Jordan River on dry land. Now, the Jordan River is not the Red Sea, but you try to do it on dry land. He did. He renewed the covenant with God, the covenant that Moses had made at Mount Sinai. Joshua renewed the covenant. And then he led the children of Israel to the conquest of the land of Israel. My guess is that the children of Israel in schools in Israel today read the book of Joshua with greater interest than they read the whole earlier part of the Bible. In a way, for them, That's when Jewish history began. Everything else was a prelude. But Jewish history really began with the Jews and Israelites entering and occupying the land of Israel, making it their homeland. I remember years ago hearing David Ben-Gurion saying that very same thing. He said Zionism did not begin with Theodor Herzl establishing the Zionist organization. Zionism began when Jews began to come and settle on the land of Israel. That's when it all started. And the first 12 chapters of the book of Joshua describe how he conquered the land. Boom, boom, boom. One city after another. One area of the country after another. Until we come and we read in the end of chapter 11, the last verse. Thus Joshua took the entire land according to all that Hashem had spoken to Moses. Joshua gave it to Israel as a heritage according to their divisions, to their tribes. The Lord then rested from war. Mission accomplished. But there's a problem. As soon as we get to chapter 13, verse 1, here's how chapter 13 begins. Joshua was old, well on in years. And Hashem said to him, "You have grown old. You are well on in years." I have to confess, I wouldn't be happy for anybody to tell me that. But it's a fact. And very much land still remains to be possessed. Mission is not accomplished. Lots of land still remains. And if you read in the book of Judges, which we'll talk about next week, and you read the book of Samuel, you'll find that there really was many important cities remaining in Canaanite hands that Joshua did not conquer. Especially the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem wasn't conquered until David. So on the one hand, in this very same book of Joshua, it says that he took the entire land, and right away there's an admission. Lots hasn't been taken yet. Contradictory. Why do you find such a contradiction, one chapter after another? The answer is simple. The book of Joshua, like all the books of the Bible, well, I shouldn't say all, but certainly these early ones, did not have an author. Remember the first day when we started this course? The first day we pointed out the Bible is not a book. It's a library. Nobody wrote the Bible. What people did was collect manuscripts, edit them, redacted them, put them together as a book. All of these manuscripts were, like in modern times, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Bits and pieces, very hard to read and very hard to put together. There are scientists to this day, many scientists, who are working just at putting together some of those fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So part of the book of Joshua was written by somebody. Another part of the book of Joshua was written by somebody else. Now, the fact that they don't match or they're contradictory, that's the way it is. Tough luck. They're both biblical fragments. And that's what gives Bible scholars an opportunity to talk about it, and that's what we're doing today. But there's even a bigger problem for the book of Joshua. The bigger problem is the enormous amount of archaeological work that has been done in Israel. Now, we just sang, and I want to compliment you and thank you. We just sang about the walls came tumbling down. Jericho was the first major city that Joshua conquered, according to the early part of the book. Now, how did Joshua conquer Jericho, according to the book of Jericho? Well, if you want to read really a dramatic Bubbemeise, that's a good example. He got all the priests available, and they all had shofars. And they marched around the walls of Jericho 7 times and blew the shofar. And then they all, with a dramatic blast, blew the shofars, and the great walls of Jericho tumbled down. And we still sing about it to this day. That's why I told you not to sing too loud. Now, in 1935, I was about 14 years old at that time. I, along with everybody else in the country, were startled by the headlines in the local newspaper, in the headlines of papers all over the world. Those headlines all said the same thing. Professor John Garstang has proven that the Bible is correct. He has found the fragments of the walls of Jericho. He was one of the early archaeologists that worked in Israel. It was proof that this story in the Bible really happened. But as the old song goes, it ain't necessarily so. Garstang was one of the earliest archaeologists. That tells you how long the whole science of biblical archaeology has been. This is in the 1930s. I remember the 1930s. But there have been decades of work in archaeology in Israel since then. And what the archaeologists have identified because of their ability to date archaeological finds. One of the best systems is what's called carbon dating. And they found out that the walls of Jericho came down 200 years before Joshua got there. Not only that, but they found out, they studied hundreds of tells in Israel, sites mentioned even in the book of Joshua, where there was clear evidence that there was no battle during that 100 years, because battles in those days were easy to identify. How do you think they did it? How do you identify something that happened at a particular time archaeologically? How?
Weapons.
What?
Weapons, debris.
What?
Weapons.
Weather.
Weapons. Weapons that they call it.
Spears, swords, artifacts.
They're saying weapons and debris.
What?
Weapons and debris.
Not weapons and debris, no. Something more specific. Every time there was a war being fought, the victors burned down the buildings and everything else at that time. That was the nature of battle. They looked for levels of ashes, and there weren't any at that time. You know, tells have layers, layer after layer, and they can go through that like a cake and identify the time for each layer. That's the science of archaeology. So there's clear evidence that in the 13th and 14th century, before the Common Era, there was no large-scale conquest in Palestine or Israel. So how do we know that that was when Joshua was supposed to be living and active. How do we know that? We don't have any newspaper accounts. Anybody have a suggestion? Well, in the Bible, and this is the way ancient history works, especially in Palestine. In the Bible, there is mention of the work that the Israelite slaves did, and one of them was building a store city called Ramses. When you find that name, you know it has to refer to the Egyptian ruler Ramses. And it fits exactly with Ramses II, we know a lot about him from Egyptian records, that we know practically year by year what happened during that period. So it has to have happened around the time of Ramses, and that's the 13th century. So there were all the evidence archaeologically was that Joshua did not conquer the land of Israel, as we read in the first 12 chapters. And not only that, I also read even what the Bible said in chapter 13, that he did not conquer the entire land. But now, let's just look at it from a common sense point of view. If we assume that indeed this happened, the exodus from Egypt, the Israelites leaving the land of Egypt and coming to the land of Israel, we already pointed out, I think last week or the week before, we already pointed out that the numbers are not all that great. Certainly not what the Bible says, 600,000 men of military age. That's totally impossible. And so I explained to you that what the Bible literally says, that it doesn't say 600,000 in English, it says shesh me'ot elef, 600,000. But we can read the word elef in Hebrew as aluf, because you don't have in the text vowel symbols. So if it's 600 aluf, that would be, an aluf is a military leader, a captain. So if it's that number, we're not talking about more than about 5,000 or 6,000 Israelites. That's manageable 40 years in the desert. But it's not very reasonable to assume that a bunch of just relieved slaves, even say about 6,000 of them, who had lived as slaves, which means no military training whatever, should come into Canaan and conquer cities like Jericho. You know, Jericho is considered to be the oldest city in the world. And it had fortifications, soldiers. It's too much to imagine that could have happened that way. So Christine Hayes, in her book, provides us, she didn't make this up, this is the result of a lot of research, with a very interesting explanation for what really happened. What she said was, when they came to Palestine, to Eretz Yisrael, they did not conquer the land, but they merged with the Canaanites. And they brought with them a unique message which attracted many Canaanites to join them. As a matter of fact, we know during that period that other Semites also came into Palestine, besides the Israelites coming from Egypt. How many, we don't know. No records. How do we know this? We have to depend on whatever knowledge we have. You know, when we're studying ancient history, all we can do is use whatever scraps of information that we do find. You know, today if you want to know something, you Google. But that's not conceivable. One of the great bits of information that we have of the ancient world involving Palestine or Israel is what's called the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters. That means there have been found in Egypt, where there, as you know, has been an enormous amount of archaeological work. There have been found a cache of letters at a place called Amarna in Egypt. These are letters from governors of Canaanite cities to the Pharaoh. At that time, and this is during the period that we have already mentioned, the 18th dynasty. Remember the name Thutmose III. He conquered Palestine. He was the greatest conqueror in ancient Egypt history. And what the Egyptians did was, having conquered Palestine, they established posts in Palestine. Just like today, we have diplomatic posts in cities around the world. You know, here in Portland, for example, we have diplomatic posts for a number of cities, number of countries around the world. And they would send reports back to Egypt about, mostly about problems that they have, asking for help from the central government in Egypt. Among these Amarna letters, there are many references to a group of people in Palestine called Habiru. It doesn't take much imagination to make an association between the word Habiru and Hebrew. And that's what the ancient Israelites were called, Hebrews, Ivri. What does the word Hebrew mean, Ivri? It means those who crossed over. In terms of Palestine, it means those who crossed over the Jordan River into the land of Palestine. In other words, the Amarna letters tell us about waves of Semites who came into Palestine during that period, just as there were Israelites coming from Egypt. Now, Israelites and Canaanites shared a common civilization, a common culture. And here is a group of devoted Israelites. And that's one of the really remarkable things for which I have no explanation. I don't know how long the Israelites lived in Egypt as slaves. The Bible says 400 years. Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. But there's clear evidence in the Bible of Egyptian influence on the Israelites. The clearest, in my mind, the clearest is the name Moses. Who was the great conqueror of Egypt? Moses. Sat is the Egyptian god Thoth. So, from what information we have, there were Israelites living in Egypt who did leave Egypt, and the chances are good that they would have left during the time of Ramses II. So they came into Palestine and merged with the existing population. And we have evidence of the merging in the book of Joshua, which I'll come to in a minute. Habiru came in from the east of Palestine, also merged with the existing Canaanite population. So it's not so much that Joshua conquered Canaanite cities, but they merged with the Canaanite population, and many of the Canaanites became attached to Yahvism. Now, the example from the book of Joshua. There's a story about the city of Gibeon. and the Gibeonites in Palestine. Now, Gibeon was a Canaanite city, and the Gibeonites were Canaanites. So the book of Joshua tells the story that they had heard many things about this group, Israelites, that had come into Canaan from Egypt, and their weird religion about Yahweh, one God. And Gibeonites came to the Israelites and said they want to join up with them. But before they did that, the Gibeonites who came all put on tattered clothing, worn out shoes, because they heard, and this is what it does say in the book of Joshua, that I'm certainly not proud of. When you come to the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, drive out and destroy everybody living there. As a matter of fact, and again, I'm even embarrassed to talk about this to you, even today, there are political groups in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, who draw attention to the book of Joshua and said what Israel should really do is to drive out all of the Palestinians from the country. That's the philosophy of a number of extremists in Israel today, drawing upon the book of Joshua. So they came to Joshua, the Gibeonites, wearing these costumes, and they said, "We have come from a very long, long distance. We're not Canaanites. We don't live in this area. But the fame of your exploits has reached our ears, and we're so impressed. We want to get to know you and hopefully to join you." And Joshua agreed, welcomed them. Then he found out that he had been duped, that they really were Canaanites. But he had already established a principle of driving out Canaanites. So they made a deal. Okay, you can stay, but you're not going to be full first-class citizens of our country. And as I say, even today, there are people who say, all right, if we don't drive out the Palestinians, they should never be given equal rights as citizens. So what took place was a merger. Israelites came in, joined the local Canaanite population, and originally they came from them and brought with them the faith in Yahweh. One other point that I want to make. So if this first 12 chapters, by all archaeological accounts, is a Baba Maisa, there never was a conquest, there never was a military takeover. How come it's in the Bible like that? Why did he write such a thing? And the answer is that that was not unusual in the ancient world. And we talked about one example of it that I want to remind you of. Remember when we talked about the Hyksos? Show me at least your hands. The Hyksos. According to Egyptian records, the Hyksos were a great army that invaded Egypt. And they brought with them terrible weapons. What was one of those weapons? What? The horse-drawn chariot that was just like a tank, today's tanks. And we couldn't resist them. And they took over our country. And then we had the second intermediate period of the 13th and 14th dynasties. Then our people arose and drove them out and created the great 18th dynasty. They didn't tell the truth. Scientists, archaeologists know what really happened. They had brought in so many Semitic slaves during the middle period of Egyptian history that eventually, as the rulership, the pharaohship, declined in strength and power, the slaves took over Egypt for 200 years. But they didn't want to admit it, that they actually were taken over by Semitic slaves whom they despised. So they concocted this cock and bull story about the Hyksos invading them with powerful armies when there's absolutely no sign of Hyksos anywhere in the Middle East. If they did that, where'd they come from? We don't know. You know, we hear a lot today about fake history. Believe me, there's nothing new about fake news. It has a long, long history. This is fake history. But it gives you a lot of pride to read it. Look what we did. Imagine, our ancestors were slaves, and they came in to the land of Israel and conquered the country and took over, and wonderful. So that's the problem. It's particularly difficult when you're talking about ancient history, because essentially there's so little real evidence that we have. We just have to make the best of it. And fortunately, there still are archaeologists out there working their butts off, coming up with new bits of evidence, and who knows what will be found. So, but we have to look at the Bible, recognize it, and value it for what it does have, which is amazing. But also it doesn't hurt to be critical of it and to understand why it says what it says. And I think the book of Joshua gives us a really wonderful example of that to think about. Now we're going to be taking up then next week the book of Judges, which follows up, and you can continue to read in the book on that. Mary Goldhammer brought in to me something she got that was made in Ethiopia, and it shows a embroidery done by Ethiopian Jews of the walls of Jericho that tumbled down. So I thought I would show this to you as well, and you can come up and look at it to give you an idea of the impact of that story in Joshua on Jews everywhere in the world. So let's take a couple minutes if you have any comments or questions. Okay.
Rabbi, I just read Google, and it said that Damascus is the oldest city in the world, 11,000 years.
What?
Google, the famous Google,
Yeah.
says Damascus is the oldest city in the world. It's 11,000 years old, and Jericho is 7,000 years old.
All I want to tell you, I rely on Google a lot, but I wouldn't bet my life on what Google says.
Well, Jericho was the first fortified city. That's
What?
He didn't say that Jericho was the oldest city. He said it was the oldest fortified
I said
city.
Jericho was.
Jericho. You said that. You said Jericho was the first fortified and armed city, not the oldest city in the world. It was the oldest.
Sorry.
You said that Jericho was the oldest armed and fortified city, not necessarily the oldest city in the world.
That's what many archaeologists say. That's all I can say. I'm not an archaeologist. But read other sources and you'll come across that same information. That I'm sure of. You know, in Israel, there's a big competition between what is the first settlement in Israel. And that's already in modern times. I've always insisted that Petach Tikva was the first settlement in Israel. Frankly, aside from other things, I'm biased. And Rishon LeZion also claims to be the first settlements, and its name is the first in Zion. The argument goes on to this day, and that's basically in our lifetimes. Can you imagine? We're talking about thousands of years ago as to which was first. Any other?
The newest issue of National Geographic has an article about this archaeological and that that it didn't happen. It's in this month's issue.
It's generally agreed by archaeologists the conquest did not happen. But what probably did happen is, I said, there was an influx of immigrants, both from the West, both from Egypt, and from the east, Semitic immigrants into Palestine at approximately that same time, and with them came the Yavization of the Israelites. But it was not a conquest.
Is there any proof that Joshua existed?
What?
Is there any proof that Joshua existed?
Is there any proof that Joshua existed?
There's no proof that anybody existed. I mean, if you want a birth certificate, no. One interesting, though, the Bible does tell us. You know, that Joshua, his Bible emphasizes he's as close as possible, a copy of Moses. So how long did Moses live? That you should know. Because it's become the traditional prayer. You wish that somebody should live to what? 120 years. That's how long Moses lived. So how long did Joshua live? 110 years. Almost like Moses, not quite. Well, sometimes in life, you have to be satisfied to be an almost like. And Joshua was. Okay, thank you very much.